Before we dive into the Q&A, I've asked Peter, because the content marketplace is a different approach. It's sort of looking at Thomson Reuters becoming a platform company. It was very different than a lot of what we've been talking about, working with mobile platforms, social platforms. So I asked Peter to go through and do a few slides kind of giving us the framework for that, and then we'll dig into the Q&A. So.
It's the left that advances intuitively?
No, it's the other right. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, if you want to stand or you want to sit?
No, I can stay here if that's all right. So actually, I'm really glad Kathy made the comment that platforms is sort of a loaded term and it means so many different things to different people. And I'll share with you a quick story. I was in Israel last week with the Clear Forest guys, and I was getting very frustrated that within the same conversation with people in the same company with a common perspective on how we address our customers' needs, we used product, service, and platform almost interchangeably. And so I had a session with the guys about a compare and contrast and defining product, platform, and service and what it means. And it ended up being a really animated discussion, and partly probably because they're Israelis, it was a very animated discussion. And at one point I started to choke, and I was like really almost in need of the Heimlich. And these guys kept on arguing the entire time. I could have gone down purple on the table, and they would have kept on arguing about what was a product versus what was a platform. So. And that was just last week after we decided to do this, so probably it is pretty timely that we cover this. So Thomson Reuters, we are in the process of moving from silos of content to a content as a platform, thinking of content as a platform. And I'll just quickly show you what we have today. Thomson was extremely acquisitive of content assets. Reuters was acquisitive of content assets. They all sat independent in silos. For each of those cylinders, you can think of it as any number of the dozens and dozens of content assets that we have, whether it be earnings estimates or company fundamentals or IPOs, M&A data, institutional stock ownership, legal information, all the way down the line. And what we do is, in order to build products, we take these silos, we put them into an application database, but they still sit as a silo within that application database. But in order to try and give you, the user, some sort of unified experience, we do a very thin veneer of concordance across all of these silos to try and get them to look like they work well together. Quite honestly, it leads to lackluster results. It leaves a lot of opportunity on the table, an awkward search experience, an awkward navigation experience and such. So what we strive to do with Content Marketplace is to break down all of those silos, to go all the way back to as far upstream in the content ingestion process as possible, have the content organized properly with entity masters and with content masters, eliminating duplication, mastering relationships between content, and mastering relationships between entities. So now, instead of that thin veneer of concordance of trying to make these things look like they belong together, we've actually have done it uniquely, robustly, very well defined, all the way back at the start of the content creation process. And then ultimately, when someone wants to build a product, then they're just taking the pieces that they need and they fit together very well. They're meant to work together. You don't have that ugly veneer of concordance. Sort of a silly analogy, I kind of think of Content Marketplace, or this aspect of Content Marketplace, there's a lot more to it, but this particular aspect of Legoizing our content. So we're making Lego bricks out of it. Different sizes, different colors, different shapes, but they all snap together really easily. We're not, and this is where I think the platform part comes in, at least my definition of a platform. We're not determining what gets built. We're just making these Lego bricks, and we're letting our product developers, we're letting our customers decide what gets built. And for me, that's the big distinction between a product and a platform. A product, you're determining what the workflow is. You're determining what the parameters are that someone comes in to query for information, or how they're going to use the content that you're providing them. In the case of a platform, you don't know. So you're making it as flexible as possible for them to assemble it the ways that they want. And so, in the multi-platform world, I'm sort of agnostic to that, because I want to provide these generic Lego bricks that allow someone to build what it is that they need to pull together. So that's
great.
Sorry, we didn't rehearse.
That's okay. That's great. So hopefully that gives everybody a little context for the discussion. So Peter, you're talking about taking Thomson Reuters and sort of transforming it from a product company to a platform company. Clearly, there's a lot of cultural change that comes in that. Can you share some of the experiences and what you guys have done to try to get all that moving in the right direction, in the same direction? Anyway?
Yeah, so it is definitely more of a culture change than it is a technology challenge. There's lots of heavy lifting to be done to get the content organized properly, and there's lots of technological challenges that go into managing the vastness of the content. But what it really comes down to is changing the way that we think about content, changing the way we think about our products, having more leverage of using content across the board, and breaking down not only the silos of content, but the silos of how our businesses operate, where getting folks to want to share more and not thinking about their particular P&L, but rather, in a sense, what's best for our shareholder value. An example that I like to use is that the signatory on a patent may also be an expert witness in a lawsuit, may also be the director at a company and also a shareholder in that company. We have all that information today, and mentioned in the news and any other number of things you can throw into the silly example. We have all that information today, but it all sits independently. And sometimes it's easier for us to work with third parties and vend through them than it is to share with across the IP and science group and the investors group and so forth. So the big thing is about trying to encourage that culture change of wanting to share more.
Okay, great. And speaking of all those sort of data, so metadata becomes a real big piece. So you've got your Lego blocks that can fit, but knowing that that person who's the shareholder in one database is also the IP, the guy on the patent, takes a different level. What role is metadata playing? What have you been doing to sort of normalize metadata across? Yeah,
so that's a great question, because the metadata is actually the sort of the secret sauce to all of this. Metadata is another one that means a lot of different things to different people, and if not, at a minimum, it always makes people's eyes roll back in their head. And so what we use to get away from calling it metadata is we call it the common language of content. So we don't have to build a massive data warehouse that can handle any type of data, but rather to establish a common language of content where there are a few aspects that the content can communicate. Some of the key entities, companies, people, instruments, quotes, legal jurisdictions, those are things that can be shared. Then the kinds of descriptive metadata like geographies and industries, time zones, holidays, other things like that allow the content to work well together. So without that metadata, forget about what the actual earnings estimate might be or what the sales figure for the last 12 months might be. It's the ways that you describe that content, locate it, and make it connected to others that is in many cases more valuable than the underlying piece of information itself. And along with that comes the relationship data. So really simply, company A acquires company B, that's a relationship. Or company C is issuer of a security, that's a relationship. And for Thomson Reuters, we literally have tens of thousands of those types of relationships that we master. And so knowing the connections between the content, again, sometimes is more important than knowing the value and the cell of a spreadsheet.
Great, thanks. So Teri, picking up on the sort of metadata theme, whether it's getting disparate data sets to work together or just looking at a traditional publisher wanting to push out content to multiple platforms, the need for metadata and data in general just becomes greater and greater. That you might need, I know with one of the clients I had worked with previously, they generate something like 30-something different thumbnails for every image because you need it different on a phone than on an iPad than on whatever. So what is the impact on a publisher and on the workflow, and maybe talk a little bit to that to create all those?
Sure. Well, I certainly think there is an impact, and I guess I would start by looking at the question from a slightly different angle, which is the reality that your content producers are increasingly expected to work across all media types. And so that's putting pressure on on them, and all but the very most recent graduates from journalism schools, because if nothing else, their comfort levels are greater with certain types of content than others. So you need to be able to address any gaps in their skill sets as a result of that, and need to think through that process. But then, in terms of actually executing, you need to think about prioritizing and which end product you're going to work on first. And so then it becomes a question of thinking about, well, what is the relationship? We're here today to talk about mobile. What is the relationship among your different end delivery points? So is your mobile app, is the call to action there to drive your user back to your website? Presumably, yes, it is. So maybe that's where you start delivering first, and then you work your way back and deliver the content to other sites. So there's a whole thought process that needs to go on about how to prioritize the content.
Okay, and looking at different types of content, that one that, just talking about Fred's panel and others, video is becoming increasingly important, particularly on mobile and others. That one seems like a bigger challenge to me, to sort of take your team and say, okay, now you guys are going to do video. I know you've had some experiences sort of looking at that.
Yeah, painful experiences, I think, would be a better way to describe it. Because frankly, the skill set that your typical writer or editor has is one of gathering information, synthesizing it, and delivering it. When you're talking about video, you're talking about a different realm of skills, right? So you need to be able to in many cases, at least in my experience, is the journalist or even the editor is expected to be in front of the camera. So there needs to be a comfort level doing that. The ability to talk fluidly and interview someone live on camera, not easy. People go to broadcast school for learning how to do those skills. And then on the production end of things, you need to be able to work comfortably in editing the content as well. So, I've worked with organizations which have really feel flat-footed in the face of this expectation, and they're really circling back and thinking about how they're going to get their content producers up to speed on these new skills. And
is it an outsourced play then, or what do you sort of recommend for those guys who just are locked in?
Right. So, I guess the thinking commonly is that you've made a commitment to your team, and you need them to stay around. This is the reality. So, my recommendation typically is to train. You might need to, in the short term, bring in outsiders to help with the tasks, but I also recommend thinking really creatively about how you're going to get those skills in-house and whom you're going to bring in to train them. So, in one case, I recommended a media consultant. You really just need someone who can get you comfortable improvising on some level and then working with the technology.
Peter, so, and taking, again, with sort of looking at visual content, whether it's images, video, all kinds of stuff, world's getting sort of richer in terms of rich data. Parts of the TR organization, more on the R side, I guess, have always been focused on, photo library and things like that. Is that starting to permeate the other parts of the organization? How's that?
It is now. Certainly over the past couple of months, we've done quite a lot of internal reorganizing. Since the merger of Thomson Reuters, the old Thomson professional businesses sat very separate from the merger of Thomson Financial and Reuters. In fact, I like to say that in some instances, it was really, other than having a common logo and a common business card, there was really very little interaction between the two. Those boundaries have been broken down, and now it's one single operating entity. And one of the things that is most important to leverage across the two are our news assets. And so that's getting a major push for us now, is to bring news across both, because it's such a way that our customers start to use our data. It's because something happened in the news that generates a lot of activity for us. And so we have a long way to go to start to make that the news, whether it's text, video, or photo, come alive and make it dynamic and make it interact with the fielded databases that we have and the other kinds of financial information or legal information. Making those connections are incredibly important for us.
Okay, and I guess for both of you, we start with Peter on this. Talking about technology platforms, for your own experiences, but also just for others in the room thoughts. When you're looking at making these kind of changes, what are your recommendations? What have your experiences been in terms of what infrastructure do you look to replace? What do you look to leverage? Do you build small? Do you
Yeah. So I guess I have the luxury. I could sort of punt the question because what I do is on the information architecture aspect of it. So it's completely abstracted from the technology, right? It's more about policies and governance and the ways that you should be managing your content. It's not about centralization or prescribing a particular technology. But not punting on your question or trying not to. We don't have, at Thomson Reuters, we don't have the opportunity to start small. We kind of almost always have to do it at a very, very large scale. And with a large degree of redundancy and robustness, right? Just take, for example, our real-time networks. If that goes down, Wall Street goes down in many instances. So we have an incredible amount of time and energy that goes into building these things at a very large scale with a very high throughput. In most instances, a lot of the stuff that we do is homegrown because we have a very specific purpose, a very specific need, and so we don't really look to outside content management systems to be able to handle what we're doing. We may use off-the-shelf stuff in limited instances and deploy it within our own editorial systems and delivery systems, but we're not on a whole. It doesn't really quite work for us.
Okay. And Teri, I know with some of your clients, you've had similar experiences with the, what do we build, what do we buy, what do we, how long can we go with this? With the rapid rate of change, what are you seeing in terms of how your publishing clients are dealing with this?
Specifically with regard to CMS type issues,
or
just skill sets?
I think more on the tools at this, the technology, the back, the CMSs, and the sort of downstream components from that to get it to the to different platforms.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot. It sort of depends where they are on the trajectory of. Again, we've been focusing on mobile, but in terms of going down the path. So earlier on, you're going to want to. Fiddle around and find out what your tools you're going to need to play the game, and then once then you have to think about the whole compatibility issue with your existing systems, and then you're going to start acquiring more and more. And the higher your level of commitment to, let's say the new platform of mobile, the more it's going to impact your existing tools. And so, it has an impact on your web CMS. In terms of its ability to deliver on the mobile front, and then once you start messing with that, then you end up looking back at how your web CMS interacts with your print CMS. So definitely has a ripple effect. But out of the gate, you're going to want to go incrementally and then see how it impacts the rest of the system.
Okay, and then. What about APIs and where do they come into play? I guess for either obviously, whether you're Peter, obviously a lot of it is for internal applications, but also you've got external parties providing content and accessing it. Where do APIs fit in that world for Thomson? And
yeah, so we have. If we think about the layer of content as a platform, we have all of the supply of content that comes from our databases of record, and we have a means of delivering that data. We call it SDI, Strategic Data Interfaces. It's XML based, and it can be delivered in file or message based, and that would be what would supply that aggregation layer, the content as a platform. And then on the product side of it, whether it's our own products or our customers or third-party distribution, then we have a set of APIs for runtime calls, for live product calls to get to that data.
Okay. I want to shift the gears a little bit. And by the way, if there are questions throughout, don't hold them to the end. Feel free to jump up and down, wave your hand. We'll find you. But looking at some of the other operational issues, we touched on these a little bit yesterday. In terms of the challenge in both recruiting and retaining technology professionals, particularly in markets, this market, San Francisco, New York, LA, not very easy to find good talent and keep it. Kind of what are you doing? What are you seeing being, in terms of your worlds to make that work?
Okay. I think it is hard to get access to good resources, and it's expensive, particularly by a lot of publisher standards. And so, I think organizationally, you're going to want to think through the whole hire, train, outsource, pros and cons of each of those, and then just figure out when each of those options is a good one. And again, at the earlier phases, consider the outsourcing and training options, and then once your level of commitment is such, you can explore the hiring. But it can be hard. It can be hard to find the talent that you need, and so you might end up sticking with the outsource model, and you have to understand the risks involved inherent with that, right? So your vendors are going to have multiple projects coming at them from multiple clients, and so their level of commitment is going to be more limited, and their familiarity with your internal systems is going to be limited, and they walk away from the project when it's done. But it might be your best bet in terms of getting the best caliber that you need on a high priority project.
Okay, and I guess we can add offshoring into that mix as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And Peter?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Teri and I were talking about this at lunch a little bit with big data and capital B, capital D, the emergence of this sort of industry, if you will. And for old line industry participants such as Thomson Reuters, we really need to think differently about how we go about generating our content and providing it to our customers, and in a slightly different direction than the technology aspect. We employ thousands of people around the world in offshore locations to aggregate our content, to do the data analysts, to do the content generation work for us. And it was a time when all of those people were based in New York, London, and high-cost locations, and so then the play was to offshore them and capture the labor arbitrage. And I think that's passed us by as well. These places are becoming expensive, and it doesn't scale to the kind of volumes of information that we're seeing today. And I like to sort of challenge people even within Thomson Reuters and say, if you go to anybody in our company and you say, we're going to go build a new database, tell me what it's going to take, a new content offering. What you're going to get back is, I need this many desks in Bangalore, I need this many desks in Beijing, and I need to start up a staff in Europe because I got to get European languages and such. And I said, and instead, if you went to something like the Big Data Conference, Strata, we were talking about at lunch, and you said, I'm going to need to start up this database, the person's going to say, I need an account on Amazon, on the cloud, on EC2, and I'm going to need a case of Red Bull, and come back to me in a couple of weeks' time. It's a very, very different approach. I'm right now personally really interested in crowdsourcing. I think what we've done in the past in Thomson Reuters, because we didn't have a very good way of atomizing the work that needed to be done. We couldn't Henry Ford it into an assembly line. So instead what we did was create these incredibly complex training manuals where it takes someone 9 months to gain proficiency to be self-sufficient on a particular database in a particular asset class. Now what we're seeing with things like Mechanical Turk and more clever ways of atomizing this stuff, you can break this stuff down. It doesn't have to be done where you have that 9-month lead time. It could be done for a penny a transaction, using this collective capability of the crowd to generate this stuff. And I think it can really transform the way that we do business.
Okay, great. Teri, yesterday you were during a boot camp, we walked through the different life cycles for new initiatives, kind of the test mode, and we're starting to see some results. We've got, and then, rollout. And I know one of the recommendations you had was use your existing resources during the early phases to test and sort of apply them. But a lot of the times those resources just don't have the skills for these. So kind of how do you bridge that when you're testing out new? I'm going through one of these right now, and it's sort of I've got someone who's sort of struggling along to do this, and I'm like, all right, now my test becomes mediocre. I've got mediocre results because of the person. So how do you bridge that? What are your thoughts on that?
I think part of the biggest part of the challenge, in a sense, is a failure of imagination on the part of your existing staff. They're so accustomed to doing something one way, and you introduce a new twist on it, and there's a learning curve for all of us. So what often makes sense is during that experimental, so yesterday I outlined the sort of 3 different phases of product development where you're experimenting, you create a trial that gets corporate funding to support it, and you launch it into the market, and you test its viability, and then when you've got enough pool of those products, you get into actually building a dedicated team, in this case around mobile. So in that very first phase, when you're just experimenting, it is going to be, again, a combination of sending out your existing team and saying carve out an agreed upon percentage of your time each week to tinker with the existing tools. And it may very well be that in that transition from that experimental phase to that second trial phase, when you're actually building a product, that you bring in outsiders to, again, bridge that imaginative gap and just get the team across it to thinking about, well, yes, here there's really cool tools. How do we marry them with the content we've got and make a viable product in a new platform?
Okay. And Peter, your thoughts on, I think the challenge is maybe a little slightly different there, is kind of at a massive company like TR, it becomes hard to sort of test things out sometimes. What do you guys do? What's worked?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I guess more than anything, it's about having a couple of champions to be willing to do some skunk works and to divert some resources to be able to try and build something new and a new capability. But then when we've done that, we've done the innovation part extremely well, and we've come up with really clever capabilities and really clever solutions, and then we struggle to productize it. We can't quite get out of that innovation phase into the product phase, usually because the innovation started without necessarily a business sponsor, right? It was somebody who had a good idea and had a passion for it, and they pursued it, and they proved that it could work, and then trying to get a business to buy into it and to pay for it becomes a very tricky endeavor.
Okay. We've got a few minutes left. I want to leave a few minutes for questions. I thought I'd throw to each of you kind of just to share one or two key issues or considerations that publishers should be thinking about when they're starting to explore making their content ready for multiple platforms, or in a case like a Thomson Reuters, exposing turning it into the platform to expose that content. What are a few things that maybe aren't so obvious that lessons learned?
Well, one that we're facing now, and it's a very real challenge for us, is licensing agreements, where we were to for all of the various third parties that we deal with, which number into the thousands. If we were to get unlimited agreements, both geography, product-wise, customer segment-wise, it would be cost prohibitive for us to get everything unlimited. But then when you want to start sharing and you want to start getting that leverage, you run into a real challenge of whether or not you're licensed to be able to do so, or if you're violating someone's intellectual property rights and so forth. So that becomes a very real restraint for us that we have to contend with in going back and renegotiating or whatever it might be. And then people sense deep pockets and opportunity and such. So we try and dance between the raindrops on that one.
Okay, great. Teri, a couple of takeaways there.
Yeah, I actually leaned over and said pricing. I think you need to really think about your business models. It's not obvious. And in fact, I would ask you, are you finding when you're making this shift to the platform, is the anticipation that your existing clients, businesses presumably, are going to continue to be your primary customer in this new platform world? Or is it actually the companies you've been licensing content for who are now suddenly becoming your customers as well?
So certainly the existing businesses, the challenge though is getting their buy-in, because they're motivated and incented to sort of protect the old, and the new model of the platform is threatening to the way that they are compensated today, to the ways that they think about what they own and what they control. And so trying to get past that, and we're actually having discussions about whether we try and get to this platform capability within the existing organizational construct, or do we almost set up a parallel business, if you will, without actually being as formal as a business, but a parallel effort that operates independent of the constraints of P&L and so forth, of having business partners to answer to on that, because it may be the only way that we get it done, because otherwise there's too much vested interest in protecting the old in the existing $12, $13 billion revenue stream.
Okay, great. I wanted to open it up if anyone's got any questions in the audience. Okay, well, you got one in the back?
Tom Rump, Highwire Press. I was interested in your business model for crowdsourcing. Are you offering any incentive for people to provide the information, A, and B, then do you turn around and sell that information?
Yeah, so we're just getting started in it now. I think there are aspects of crowdsourcing where we might use Mechanical Turk or a service similar to that just to do some of our very mundane content collection, so that we would just pay for that. There's other aspects, I think, that get more to your question, which is effectively the private cloud, our community of users, the folks in the legal space or in the investment banking space, in the trading community, and trying to leverage from them their collective wisdom and incent them to contribute to us. And we actually had a little bit of a discussion about this at lunch, that there are, at times, I think, we have to find the right pockets. There are times that a community member would be motivated to tell us and contribute content to us because they want to be represented correctly in our systems and so forth. There are other times where they actually don't want to tell us their wisdom or their knowledge because they view it to be competitive advantage. For example, and we've had customers say this to us, if they spot a mistake in our database, we've talked to them about incentives for them to tell us about errors in the database, and they say, why would I tell you about an error in your database? That's my advantage. Let everybody else who's looking at your service think that's the right number when I know that it's actually different. So it's a difficult one to overcome, but I think we have to pick our spots where there are definitely some areas where someone would want to make sure that they themselves or their company is accurately represented in the database and would be willing to make contributions. Things like commenting on an M&A deal or commenting on a legal decision, maybe they'd only want to do that within their firm. They probably wouldn't want to share that thought beyond in a bigger community.
Great, thanks, Peter. Any other?
Well, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, guys.
It was a pleasure.